October 15th, 1967. The jungle along the Laotian border exhaled its morning mist like the breath of some ancient, watchful beast. 15 miles from any mapped American position, 3 CIA operatives and 5 Montagnard tribesmen worked in absolute silence, their hands threading copper wire through bamboo stalks with the precision of surgeons. The air hung thick with humidity and electrical tension from the approaching monsoon season. Radio static crackled through primitive speakers, carrying distant voices in Morse code, metallic echoes drifting down from the north like whispers from another world. The operation bore the codename White Feather, and not a single regular army unit knew they existed. In the green cathedral of Triple Canopy Jungle, where sunlight barely touched the forest floor, Agent Michael Collier adjusted the frequency dial on his PRC-47 radio set. The device, weighing nearly 30 pounds and powered by batteries that lasted barely 12 hours in the oppressive humidity, represented the cutting edge of battlefield communications technology. Its aluminum frame had been painted olive drab, but rust already crept along the edges where monsoon moisture had penetrated the protective coating. Beside him, Yilang, a Montagnard radio operator, whose tribal knowledge of the jungle's acoustic properties had proven invaluable, listened through Soviet-made headphones salvaged from a captured North Vietnamese Army communications post 3 months earlier. The morning ritual began at 0400 hours, as it had for the past 18 days. Collier would scan the frequency spectrum between 3 and 5 megahertz, searching for transmission patterns that might reveal enemy troop movements. The work required absolute concentration. A single missed signal could mean the difference between advance warning and catastrophic surprise for American forces operating in the Central Highlands. Each intercepted message was recorded on reel-to-reel tape, then hand-transcribed using encryption keys that changed daily according to protocols developed at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. The irony was not lost on the men of White Feather Station. While American forces relied increasingly on sophisticated helicopter transport, computerized artillery targeting systems, and satellite-guided bombing runs, the most critical intelligence work still depended on human ears, trained intuition, and equipment that would have looked familiar to radio operators from World War II. The jungle had a way of humbling even the most advanced technology. Moisture-corroded circuit, heat-warped antenna arrays, and the dense vegetation absorbed radio waves with voracious efficiency. 300 miles south in Saigon, the air-conditioned briefing rooms of Military Assistance Command Vietnam buzzed with confidence. Colonel James Morrison, a career intelligence officer whose previous experience had been limited to NATO operations in Western Europe, reviewed the overnight intelligence summaries with the casualness of a man reading the morning newspaper. The reports from White Feather Station, transmitted in coded bursts during brief windows when atmospheric conditions permitted long-range communication, painted an increasingly urgent picture. Enemy radio traffic had increased by 300% over the past week. Transmission patterns suggested coordinated movement by at least 2 full regiments of North Vietnamese Army forces. Most concerning of all, some intercepted communications employed Soviet R-123 radio equipment, indicating a level of technological sophistication that contradicted official assessments of enemy capabilities. Morrison set the reports aside, with a dismissive gesture that would later haunt his career. The Viet Cong don't have the training or equipment to coordinate large-scale operations by radio, he told his staff during the morning briefing. These intercepts are probably atmospheric interference from the monsoon season. Our analysts in Washington have confirmed that enemy forces lack the technical capability for sophisticated electronic warfare, but the men in the jungle knew better. They had been listening to the enemy's voice for nearly 3 weeks, and what they heard contradicted every assumption about North Vietnamese Army communication capabilities. The transmissions weren't random chatter from scattered guerrilla units. They displayed the disciplined structure of a modern military organization, call signs that changed according to established patterns, message formats that suggested formal training, and most ominously, coordination between widely separated units that implied centralized command and control. The White Feather Station occupied a clearing barely 30 meters in diameter, hidden beneath a natural canopy of bamboo and strangler figs. The site had been selected after weeks of reconnaissance by Montagnard scouts, whose knowledge of the jungle's secret paths went back generations. Located on a ridgeline that provided clear lines of sight for radio transmission, while remaining invisible from aerial observation, the station represented a masterpiece of camouflage and fieldcraft. The antenna array, constructed from copper wire salvaged from abandoned French colonial telephone lines, stretched between trees in a configuration that maximized signal reception while blending seamlessly with the jungle's natural architecture. Living conditions at Whitefeather tested human endurance in ways that no training manual could adequately prepare anyone for. The operatives slept in hammocks suspended between trees, covered by ponchos that provided minimal protection from the nightly downpours that turned the jungle floor into a swamp. Meals consisted of sea rations supplemented by rice and dried fish provided by their Montagnard allies. Though the oppressive heat often made eating a nauseating ordeal, the humidity was so intense that metal equipment required constant maintenance to prevent rust, while clothing rotted within days unless treated with antifungal pads. But the greatest challenge wasn't physical discomfort, it was the psychological strain of absolute silence. For 20 hours each day, the station maintained complete radio silence to avoid detection by enemy direction-finding equipment. Conversation was limited to essential whispers. Even the slightest unnecessary noise could compromise their position and invite a mortar barrage that would obliterate the station in seconds. The men developed a form of communication through hand signals and written notes, creating an atmosphere of monastic discipline that weighed heavily on minds accustomed to the camaraderie of normal military units. The intelligence they gathered painted an increasingly alarming picture. By the third week of October, intercepted transmissions indicated that at least 3 North Vietnamese Army regiments were converging on the Central Highlands region. The 66th NVA Regiment, previously thought to be operating in scattered company, appeared to be concentrating near the town of Dak To. Most concerning of all, radio traffic suggested the presence of Soviet advisors whose technical expertise was enabling unprecedented coordination between enemy units separated by dozens of miles. Each intercepted message was analyzed with scientific precision. Yilang's tribal knowledge proved invaluable in this process. He could distinguish between local Vietnamese dialects and identify transmission locations based on subtle variations in radio propagation that reflected the jungle's complex topography. His ability to read the acoustic landscape had been developed over years of hunting in the forest, where survival depended on interpreting the slightest sound cue. Applied to electronic intelligence gathering, these skills provided insights that would have been impossible for American-trained technicians to achieve. The breakthrough came during the pre-dawn hours of November 2nd. Collier was monitoring a frequency previously used only for what appeared to be routine administrative traffic when he detected something that made his blood run cold. A transmission in technical Russian, spoken with the crisp precision of military communications, crackled through the static. "Package ready. Moving to Omega Point." The message lasted less than 10 seconds, but its implications were staggering. Soviet personnel were directly involved in operational planning for what appeared to be a major offensive against American positions. When the operators at Whitefeather attempted to triangulate the transmission's origin using standard radio direction-finding techniques, they discovered something that defied explanation. The same message appeared to be coming from 3 different locations simultaneously, separated by distances that made simultaneous transmission impossible. Either the North Vietnamese had developed radio relay capabilities far beyond what American intelligence had assessed, or they had learned to manipulate the jungle's natural radio propagation characteristics to create false signals designed to confuse American intercept operations. The truth was even more sophisticated than either explanation suggested. Unknown to the American, Soviet advisors had been training North Vietnamese communication specialists in electronic deception techniques developed during World War II. By using the jungle's complex terrain to reflect radio signal, enemy operators could create the illusion of multiple transmission points while operating from a single concealed location. The technique required intimate knowledge of atmospheric conditions, seasonal weather patterns, and the electromagnetic properties of different types of vegetation, knowledge that took months to acquire and years to master. For the men at Whitefeather Station, the discovery of these deception techniques transformed their mission from passive intelligence gathering into an active counterintelligence operation. They began mapping the false signals, looking for patterns that might reveal the locations of genuine enemy positions. The work required them to become experts not only in radio technology, but also in the jungle's meteorological cycle. Monsoon conditions affected signal propagation in predictable ways. Morning mist scattered radio waves. Afternoon thunderstorms created electrical interference, and evening temperature inversions could bend signals around mountains and valleys in ways that defied conventional physics. As November progressed, the volume of intercepted traffic increased exponentially. Enemy transmissions now occurred around the clock, suggesting either a massive buildup of forces or a deliberate attempt to overwhelm American intelligence capabilities with false information. Collier and his team worked 18-hour shifts, recording every transmission, analyzing every pattern, searching for the authentic signals hidden among the electronic chaff. The psychological toll was enormous. Sleep deprivation, combined with the constant threat of discovery and the weight of responsibility for potentially thousands of American lives, pushed the operatives to the edge of their endurance. Collier began experiencing auditory hallucinations, phantom radio signals that seemed to carry urgent messages but dissolved into static when he tried to focus on them. Yilang, whose cultural traditions emphasized harmony with the natural world, spoke of evil spirits in the radio wave, supernatural forces that were using the equipment to spread confusion and fear. But the most disturbing development wasn't supernatural. It was all too human. On November 8th, while monitoring a frequency used primarily for enemy administrative traffic, the White Feather team intercepted a transmission that chilled them to their bones. Speaking in clear English with what sounded like an American accent, an unidentified voice provided detailed information about U.S. troop dispositions around Firebase Charlie, located 15 miles south of Dak To. The transmission included information that should have been classified at the highest levels: unit strengths, ammunition resupply schedule, and most damaging of all, planned patrol routes that wouldn't be executed until the following day. The implications were staggering. Either American security had been compromised at the highest levels, or enemy intelligence capabilities far exceeded anything that U.S. commanders had imagined. Collier immediately encoded the intercept and prepared to transmit it to Saigon headquarters, but atmospheric conditions prevented long-range communication. For 6 frustrating hours, while enemy forces presumably acted on the intelligence they had somehow obtained, White Feather Station remained isolated, unable to warn their own forces of the security breach. When communication was finally established that evening, Collier's urgent report disappeared into the bureaucratic machinery of military intelligence. The duty officer who received the transmission, a junior lieutenant whose previous experience consisted entirely of analyzing enemy propaganda broadcasts, filed the report under unconfirmed enemy intercepts and forgot about it. The information never reached operational commanders, never triggered a security investigation, and never resulted in changes to American communication procedure. Meanwhile, in the jungle around Dak To, North Vietnamese forces were executing the most sophisticated offensive operation of the war to date. The 66th NVA Regiment, reinforced by elements of 2 additional regiments and supported by Soviet-trained artillery specialists, had spent weeks infiltrating the region using trails that appeared on no American maps. Their movement had been coordinated entirely by radio, using communication techniques that turned the jungle itself into a vast antenna array. The morning of November 9th brought the first concrete evidence that White Feather's warnings had been accurate. Firebase Charlie, the same installation mentioned in the intercepted English-language transmission, came under precisely coordinated mortar and rocket attack at 05:30 hours. The enemy demonstrated intimate knowledge of American defensive positions, concentrating their fire on ammunition bunkers and communication facilities while avoiding areas where such attacks would produce minimal damage. 12 Americans died in the attack, and another 37 were wounded seriously enough to require evacuation. But in Saigon, military commanders continued to dismiss the intelligence reports from White Feather Station. Colonel Morrison, whose career had become invested in maintaining the official assessment of limited enemy capabilities, characterized the attacks as lucky guesses by guerrilla forces who lacked the training for sophisticated targeting. The possibility that American forces were facing an enemy with advanced electronic intelligence capability remained unthinkable to military leaders whose worldview had been shaped by conventional warfare against technologically inferior opponents. The men in the jungle watched their warnings go unheeded with growing desperation. They could hear the enemy's preparations for what was clearly going to be a major offensive, but their reports were either ignored or dismissed as atmospheric interference. The isolation was maddening. They possessed information that could save hundreds of American lives, but the very secrecy that protected their mission also prevented them from communicating effectively with the forces they were trying to protect. Yilang, whose understanding of the jungle's rhythms had been developed over decades of hunting and warfare, sensed something that the sophisticated electronic equipment could not detect. The forest itself was changing. Animals that normally moved freely through the area had disappeared. Bird calls that served as natural early warning systems had fallen silent. Even the insects seemed subdued. as though the entire ecosystem was holding its breath in anticipation of coming violence. On November 10th, the pattern of enemy transmissions changed abruptly. Instead of the complex, multi-frequency communications that had characterized the previous weeks, radio traffic suddenly became sporadic and routine. To inexperienced analysts, this might have suggested that enemy activity was decreasing. But to Collier and his team, the change was ominous. They had observed similar patterns in other theaters of operation: the calm before major offensive action, when enemy forces switched from coordination mode to execution mode. The White Feather Station increased its monitoring schedule to 24 hours per day, with operators working in 4-hour shifts to maintain peak alertness. The physical strain was enormous. The humid air made concentration difficult, while the constant threat of discovery created a psychological pressure that manifested in nervous tics, insomnia, and paranoid hypervigilance. But they persevered, driven by the knowledge that American lives depended on their ability to pierce the electronic veil that concealed enemy intention. Their dedication was rewarded on the night of November 11th, when Yilang detected something that would have been invisible to conventional electronic surveillance. Monitoring a frequency that had been silent for days, he noticed a subtle change in the background static, a rhythmic pattern that repeated every 17 seconds with mechanical precision. The pattern was so faint that it barely registered above the normal atmospheric noise that plagued radio communication in the tropics. But Yilang's trained ear recognized it as artificial. Collier immediately focused every available receiver on the frequency, using triangulation techniques to pinpoint the source of the mysterious signal. What they discovered defied their worst fears. Less than 800 meters from their position, concealed beneath a canopy of banana leaves and bamboo, a sophisticated enemy radio station was coordinating the movements of thousands of North Vietnamese troops. The installation was so well camouflaged that it would have been invisible even from close range, but its electronic signature betrayed its presence to anyone with the skill and equipment to detect it. The enemy station was protected by at least a squad of soldiers from the 32nd NVA Regiment, elite troops whose jungle warfare skills rivaled those of the Montagnard tribesmen. These were not the poorly trained guerrillas that American propaganda portrayed, but professional soldiers whose understanding of electronic warfare had been honed by Soviet advisors and years of combat experience. They knew that American intelligence operations depended heavily on radio intercept, and they had learned to use this knowledge as a weapon against their enemies. For the men of White Feather Station, the discovery created an agonizing dilemma. They could not attack the enemy installation without revealing their own position and compromising their mission. But they also could not allow enemy forces to continue using sophisticated communication techniques to coordinate attacks against American positions. The enemy radio station was literally broadcasting the death of American soldiers, and the White Feather team was powerless to prevent it. Collier made the decision that would define the remainder of the operation. Instead of requesting immediate extraction or calling for an airstrike against the enemy position, he ordered his team to begin systematic monitoring of all enemy transmissions from the nearby station. If American forces refused to believe the intelligence, White Feather would provide evidence so overwhelming that even the most skeptical commanders would be forced to acknowledge the threat. For 3 days and nights, the White Feather team recorded every transmission from the enemy station. They documented communication techniques that demonstrated training far beyond anything attributed to North Vietnamese forces. They intercepted tactical coordination between units separated by dozens of miles. Most damning of all, they recorded conversations between enemy officers and their Soviet advisors, conversations that revealed the true scope of foreign involvement in the conflict. But the intensive monitoring came at a terrible cost. Operating their equipment at maximum capacity for extended periods created electromagnetic signatures that sophisticated enemy direction-finding equipment could detect and track. The 32nd NVA Regiment had been trained in counterintelligence, and they were systematically searching for the American monitoring station that had been intercepting their communications. Electronic warfare had become a deadly game of hide-and-seek, with both sides using the jungle's natural characteristics to mask their activities while hunting for their opponents. The end came suddenly, without warning, in the pre-dawn darkness of November 15th. Enemy forces had spent the night maneuvering into position around the White Feather Station, using movement techniques that left no trace in the jungle's soft earth. The attack began with a coordinated barrage of grenades thrown from multiple directions simultaneously, followed immediately by automatic weapons fire from concealed positions that commanded every possible escape route. Agent Collier was struck in the chest by grenade fragments during the opening seconds of the attack. As he fell, his blood soaking into the jungle floor that had been his home for nearly a month, he managed to destroy the station's most sensitive equipment using thermite charges that had been prepared for exactly this contingency. Yilang, demonstrating the courage that had made Montagnard tribesmen legendary among American special forces, dragged the main transmitter to a nearby creek and submerged it in the muddy water before enemy forces could capture it intact. The surviving members of the team attempted to escape through the jungle using evasion routes that had been planned and rehearsed during their weeks at the station. But the enemy had anticipated their movements with uncanny precision, positioning blocking forces along every possible escape route. The jungle that had protected Whitefeather Station for nearly a month had become a trap from which there was no escape. The final transmission from Whitefeather Station was received at 0347 hours on November 15th. Transmitted in clear text because there was no longer time for encryption, the message consisted of only 7 words: Delta, no Delta, ghosts in the static, then silent. The carrier wave continued for another 37 seconds before cutting off abruptly, leaving only the empty hiss of atmospheric noise, where human voices had once carried urgent warnings of impending catastrophe. The rescue helicopter dispatched from Firebase Alpha never found any trace of Whitefeather Station or its personnel. The jungle had swallowed them completely, leaving no evidence that American intelligence operatives had ever occupied the ridgeline, where they had died defending secrets that their own command refused to believe. The site was later overrun by North Vietnamese forces during the first phase of the Dak II offensive, and any remaining evidence was deliberately destroyed to prevent reconstruction of American intelligence capabilities. 2 days after Whitefeather Station went silent, the offensive that its personnel had predicted with such accuracy finally began. The Battle of Dak To, which would rage for nearly 3 weeks and cost over 1,400 American and South Vietnamese casualties, had been orchestrated using exactly the sophisticated communication technique that Whitefeather had documented and reported. The 66th NVA Regiment, supported by elements of 3 additional regiments and coordinated by Soviet advisors using advanced electronic warfare techniques, demonstrated tactical capabilities that stunned American commanders who had dismissed enemy forces as technologically primitive guerrillas. Hill 875, the most savage battleground of the Dak II campaign, became a monument to the cost of ignoring intelligence warnings. American paratroopers of the 173rd Airborne Brigade fought for 4 days against entrenched North Vietnamese forces, who seemed to anticipate every tactical movement. Enemy positions had been prepared with a precision that suggested intimate knowledge of American operational doctrine. Defensive fires were coordinated with a sophistication that implied advanced communication capabilities. Most disturbing of all, enemy forces demonstrated knowledge of American reinforcement schedules and supply drops that should have been known only at the highest command level. The official after-action reports from Dak To made no mention of Whitefeather Station or its intelligence warnings. The classified documents described the battle as a tactical victory achieved against an enemy of unexpected capabilities, but provided no explanation for how those capabilities had been so seriously underestimated. Colonel Morrison, the intelligence officer who had dismissed Whitefeather's reports, was quietly transferred to a staff position in Hawaii, where his assessment failure could not result in additional battle casualties. But for those few individuals who knew about Whitefeather Station and understood its significance, the silence from the jungle became a haunting reminder of opportunities lost and warnings unheeded. The station's final transmission, "Ghosts in the Static," became an unofficial motto among CIA personnel assigned to signals intelligence operations. It served as a reminder that in the electronic warfare environment of modern conflict, the most dangerous enemies were often those whose capabilities were hidden behind walls of institutional disbelief and bureaucratic complacency. The tactical innovations documented by Whitefeather Station would eventually transform American intelligence operations throughout Southeast Asia. The discovery that enemy forces possessed sophisticated electronic warfare capability led to the development of new counterintelligence, improved communication security procedures, and enhanced training for signals intelligence personnel. But these improvements came too late to save the men who had made them possible, and too late to prevent the casualties that accurate intelligence might have avoided. The human cost of the intelligence failures at Dak II extended far beyond the statistical summaries contained in official casualty reports. Each number represented not only an individual tragedy, but also a systemic failure to adapt to the realities of modern warfare. The young soldiers who died on Hill 875 had been trained to fight an enemy described in official briefings as technologically inferior and organizationally primitive. They were not prepared for the sophisticated tactic, coordinated fires, and electronic warfare capabilities that North Vietnamese forces actually possessed. The families of White Feather Station personnel received only the standard notification that their loved ones had been killed in action during classified operations. The specific circumstances of their deaths, the intelligence they had gathered, and the warnings they had transmitted remained classified for decades after the war ended. Their sacrifice was acknowledged only in the cryptic language of commendation letters that spoke of exceptional service under hazardous conditions, without explaining what those conditions had been or why their service had been exceptional. Yilang's family, members of a Montagnard tribe whose loyalty to American forces had made them targets for communist persecution, received no notification at all. According to official records, he had never existed. His knowledge of jungle acoustic, his skill in electronic intelligence gathering, and his ultimate sacrifice in destroying equipment rather than allowing it to fall into enemy hands were erased from history as completely as his name was erased from personnel. The technological lessons learned from White Feather Station's brief existence influenced American military doctrine for decades after the Vietnam. The recognition that enemy forces could use natural terrain features to manipulate electromagnetic signals led to advances in electronic warfare, improved radio security procedures, and new techniques for detecting and countering electronic deception. Military communications equipment was redesigned to be less vulnerable to interception, while training programs were developed to teach personnel how to recognize and respond to sophisticated enemy surveillance tech. But perhaps the most important lesson from White Feather Station was not technological, but institutional. The tragedy of accurate intelligence being dismissed because it contradicted established assumptions became a case study in intelligence failure that was analyzed at the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and military staff colleges around the world. The station's story demonstrated how organizational culture, career incentives, and cognitive bias could combine to create intelligence blind spots that proved fatal on the battlefield. The jungle where White Feather Station had operated was eventually cleared by bombing campaigns and defoliation operations designed to deny cover to enemy forces. The ridgeline, where Collier and Yilang had died, was stripped of vegetation by Agent Orange, leaving a scarred moonscape that bore no resemblance to the Green Cathedral, where they had once listened to the enemy's electronic whispers. The trees that had supported their antenna array were reduced to blackened stumps, while the creek where they had destroyed their equipment was poisoned by chemical runoff that would persist for generations. When American forces finally withdrew from Vietnam in 1975, the site of White Feather Station was reclaimed by jungle growth that slowly erased all evidence of its existence. Vines covered the concrete antenna footing, roots broke apart the camouflaged bunkers, rain washed away the last traces of equipment that had once carried urgent warnings to commanders who refused to listen. Nature completed the task of concealment that human enemies had begun, hiding the truth as effectively as any classification stamp. But the ghosts in the static never completely disappeared. Veterans of signals intelligence operations carried the memory of White Feather Station through decades of peacetime service and civilian careers. They told the story to younger analysts, passing down lessons learned at the cost of American lives. They ensured that future intelligence professionals would understand the difference between what enemies were supposed to be capable of and what they actually could do when underestimated. The electronic warfare techniques first documented by White Feather Station became standard practice for militaries around the world. The ability to use terrain features to manipulate radio signals, the importance of communication security in preventing intelligence compromise, and the value of human analysis in detecting patterns hidden within electronic noise all became fundamental principles of modern military communication. What had once seemed like supernatural deception was revealed to be sophisticated science, applied by enemies who understood their American opponents better than American commanders understood themselves. Today, the site where White Feather Station once operated is accessible only by footpaths known to local hunters and farmers. The ridgeline offers commanding views across valleys that once echoed with the sound of helicopter rotors and artillery. Rainfall has long since washed away all traces of the blood that was shed there, while the tropical vegetation has healed scars left by grenades and automatic weapons fire. To casual observers, nothing distinguishes this piece of jungle from thousands of others scattered across the mountains of Southeast Asia. But for those who know how to listen, the The static still carries echoes of desperate warnings transmitted too late to save lives that might have been spared. The frequency spectrum above the jungle remains crowded with electronic signal, cell phone tower, satellite communications, internet traffic flowing through fiber optic cable. Modern technology has made the primitive radio equipment used by White Feather Station seem as obsolete as smoke signals or semaphore flag. Yet the fundamental challenges faced by those long-dead intelligence operatives remain unchanged in the digital age. Enemies still use deception to mask their capabilities and intention. Institutional bias still prevents accurate assessment of threats that contradict established assumptions. Human intelligence analysts still struggle to separate authentic signals from electronic chaff that grows more sophisticated with each passing year. The names and technologies change, but the underlying patterns of intelligence failure remain depressingly consistent across decades of conflict. The memorial wall at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, contains stars representing intelligence officers who died in the line of duty, but the men of White Feather Station are not commemorated. Their sacrifice remains classified, their names absent from official record, their contribution to American intelligence capabilities acknowledged only in footnotes to documents that may never be released to the public. They are remembered only by the few surviving colleagues who understood the significance of their final transmission and the terrible cost of warnings that went unheeded. The technological systems that eventually replaced human intelligence operatives can process vastly more information than any team of analysts working with primitive radio equipment and pencil-written transcript. Satellite reconnaissance, electronic surveillance aircraft, and computer-assisted signal analysis have made the kind of field intelligence work performed by White Feather Station seem quaint and inefficient. Modern intelligence operations can monitor thousands of communication channels simultaneously, identifying patterns and correlations that would have been impossible for human analysts to detect. But technology cannot compensate for institutional failures that prevent decision-makers from accepting unwelcome truths. The most sophisticated intelligence systems in the world are worthless if their output is dismissed by commanders who prefer comfortable assumptions to disturbing realities. The men who died at White Feather Station had access to nothing more advanced than World War II-era radio equipment, but they understood their enemy better than generals equipped with the latest intelligence briefings and computer-assisted analysis. Their story serves as a reminder that intelligence work is ultimately about human judgment rather than technological capability. Yilang's intuitive understanding of jungle acoustics proved more valuable than sophisticated direction-finding equipment. Collier's recognition of deception patterns provided insights that formal training and official doctrine could not deliver. The Montagnard tribesmen who supported the operation contributed knowledge that had been developed over generations of survival in an environment that challenged every assumption about what was possible. The Vietnam War produced countless examples of technological superiority being defeated by human adaptability, resourcefulness, and understanding of local conditions. But perhaps nowhere was this lesson more poignantly illustrated than in the story of White Feather Station, where a handful of intelligence operatives armed with obsolete equipment managed to penetrate enemy deception techniques that confused far larger and better equipped organizations. Their success was achieved not through technological advantage, but through patient observation, careful analysis, and willingness to accept evidence that contradicted official assessments. The jungle that swallowed White Feather Station continues to hold secrets that may never be fully revealed. The exact location of the station remains unknown, its personnel records remain classified, and the full extent of the intelligence it gathered may be lost forever. But its legacy lives on in the training procedures, operational doctrines, and analytical techniques that were developed to prevent similar failures in future conflict. For those who study intelligence history, White Feather Station represents both a cautionary tale and an inspiration. It demonstrates the catastrophic consequences that can result when accurate intelligence is ignored for institutional or political reasons. But it also illustrates the extraordinary dedication of intelligence professionals who risk their lives to provide information that might prevent the deaths of their fellow servicemen, even when that information contradicts official policy or challenges established assumptions. The men who died in the jungle northwest of Dak To were not heroes in the conventional sense. They never charged machine gun nests or led desperate assaults against impossible odds. Their courage was quieter, but no less real. They volunteered for a mission that offered no glory, no recognition, and very little chance of survival. They endured weeks of isolation, physical hardship, and psychological pressure to gather intelligence that their own command refused to believe. When death came for them, they faced it with the same professional dedication that had characterized their living service. In the end, White Feather Station succeeded completely in its mission, while failing utterly in its purpose. The intelligence operatives gathered accurate, timely, and actionable information about enemy capabilities and intentions. They documented sophisticated deception techniques that had never been observed before. They provided detailed warning of the offensive that would cost thousands of American casualties. But their success in gathering intelligence was negated by the failure of their own organization to act on the information they provided. The irony was as bitter as it was complete. American forces possessed the intelligence they needed to avoid the tactical surprises that made Daktu such a costly battle. But institutional arrogance, career considerations, and simple bureaucratic incompetence combined to ensure that critical information never reached the commanders who could have acted on it. The men who died gathering that intelligence became casualties not of enemy action, but of friendly fire in its most insidious form, the systematic destruction of unwelcome truths by the very organization they died trying to serve. Today, as new generations of intelligence analysts face similar challenges in different conflicts around the world, the story of White Feather Station remains relevant and urgent. It reminds us that the most sophisticated technology in the world cannot substitute for institutional courage, intellectual honesty, and willingness to accept uncomfortable truths. It teaches us that intelligence work requires not only technical skill, but also moral courage. The courage to speak truth to power, even when that truth challenges fundamental assumptions about enemy capabilities or friendly policies. The ghosts in the static that haunted the final transmission from White Feather Station continue to echo through intelligence operations around the world. They represent all the warnings that go unheeded, all the analysts whose expertise is dismissed, and all the opportunities lost because institutional convenience takes precedence over operational necessity. They remind us that intelligence failure is not usually the result of inadequate information, but of inadequate courage to act on information that challenges established doctrine. But they also represent something more hopeful, the possibility that dedicated professionals working with primitive equipment under impossible conditions can still make discoveries that change our understanding of what enemies are capable of achieving. Yilang's ability to detect patterns hidden in radio static, Collier's recognition of sophisticated deception technique, and the entire team's willingness to risk their lives for intelligence that might save their fellow servicemen. These human qualities remain as relevant today as they were in the jungles of Southeast Asia 5 decades ago. As you reflect on this story of courage, sacrifice, and institutional failure, consider how many modern intelligence warnings might be meeting the same fate as those transmitted by White Feather Station. How many analysts today are documenting threats that contradict official assessments? How many field operatives are risking their lives to gather intelligence that will be dismissed because it challenges comfortable assumptions? How many future tragedies might be prevented if we learn the lessons that White Feather Station died trying to teach? The memory of those brave men deserves more than classification stamps and bureaucratic silence. Their sacrifice should be honored not with monuments and ceremonies, but with institutional changes that ensure future intelligence warnings receive the serious consideration they merit. The static they heard carrying enemy plans should remind us that our adversaries are always more capable, more adaptive, and more dangerous than we want to believe. If this story has moved you, if you recognize the importance of preserving these lessons for future generations, then please share it with others who need to understand the human cost of intelligence failure. Subscribe to ensure you don't miss other stories of courage and sacrifice that remain hidden in classified files. And remember the men of White Feather Station every time you hear about intelligence warnings being dismissed because they contradict official policy. Their ghosts are still in the static, still trying to warn us, still hoping that someone will finally listen.